So we might have a bit of a start. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you out in such huge numbers. Can I just get a show of hands, those people who used to come to the play briefings down at the Bill Brown studio? Oh, so fair whack of you. Oh, it's great to keep you coming and to keep you coming in greater numbers. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. For those who I haven't met, where have you been? I'm Wesley Enoch. I'm the artistic director here at Queensland Theatre Company, and just like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in which we're meeting and just pay our respects to their elders as well as many of the elders in the room as I see the... Well, I often have a little saying which is, you know, the grey hair, the coloured hair and the absence of hair is in fact a great show of wisdom. So it's lovely to have you all here. These play briefings are really a chance to get to meet the play, if you like, and the players and the people who bring the show to fruition. Actually, you might have to do this yourselves. Pass the microphone down that way and just introduce yourselves and what you do in the show.
Hello everyone, I'm Ian Sinclair and I'm directing the show.
Hi, my name's Conrad Colby, I'm playing Frank and Andy.
My name's Harriet Dyer, I'm playing Patty.
Hi everyone, my name's Hayden, I'm playing the character of John and ensemble roles.
Hello, how you doing? My name is Dash and I play Danny in the show. I'm the one with the plane.
Hello, my name's Danny and I don't play Dash. I play the role of ensemble. So I play schoolboy, primary skirt and a few other roles.
Hello, my name is Guy Webster. I'm a composer and sound designer on the show.
Oh, hello, I'm David Walterson, believe it or not. I'm doing the lighting design for the show.
Stephen Curtis, set and costume designer for the show.
Matt Backer, I play ensemble roles, which are Douglas MacArthur and little boy Robbie the bully, and etc., etc.
Hello, I'm Hugh Parker. I'm playing the role of Monash and ensemble.
And hello, I'm Lucy Golby and I play Rose.
Some people who aren't here at the moment, I know Veronica Neve, who's playing Anne, who is the mother of the gathering, and there's Matt Ryan, who's the writer, and is that everyone? I think so. There's so many in this cast, it's so easy to mislay them. I'm going to pass this microphone down to Ian. This is going to be one of those ones. Oh, actually, Roger. Ian, just tell us a little bit about what this play is about.
Okay, it's about two things basically, I think. The first one is that it's about Brisbane in 1942, which is a very particular time for this city, especially given that the Americans arrived on the Pensacola Express early on in the year, and then the effect that had on a small town. It also happened in Townsville as well. Anybody from Townsville up there will know that Harriet's family were. Where in Townsville, the city went from like 10,000 to 100,000 overnight, and a very similar thing happened here, where the culture shifted dramatically in a very short time with the arrival of the American fleet here, which had all sorts of influences on sort of the way Brisbaneites thought of themselves, and that's the starting point for Matthew Ryan's play. But inside that, he's also very deftly inserted a coming-of-age story for a 14-year-old boy who has dreams of becoming a writer. And so those two stories interweave amongst each other in a beautiful way.
Tell us a little bit about the characters that we just quickly introduced here. I know there's a family at the centre of that, and what goes on? What's a little synopsis of what happens to that family?
Well, Danny's family, Danny has an elder brother, Frank, who's played by Conrad, who's a fighter pilot. He's been learning on Wirraways, and then he ends up being given a Kitty Hawk aeroplane and is involved in the defence of Darwin. His family is there's a very nice small scene that Matt Ryan gives us, which is a beautiful picture of sort of happy Queensland life, I think, which gets shattered fairly quickly. So when you watch the show, really soak that moment up, because it gets dark after that. No, there's lots of joy. But for Danny, his brother doesn't live in one of the very first encounters that he has flying. And poor old Danny spends the rest of his time trying to find a replacement for that figure, or on another level, trying to work out a way to fill those shoes himself with varying degrees of success. The 14-year-old boy who's gifted at writing and not very much else can do.
Dash, just thinking that this character of Danny, who's pretty much the central through line for the show. I mean, in some respects, Matt Ryan has written an allegory for Brisbane through his journey. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey of Danny and what his process of growing up is?
Yeah, well, and as you say, Matthew Ryan has taken this kind of epic story and then put it through the lens of a 14-year-old boy who's not only discovering a world that's changing around him, but a world that's changing within him as well. So he's at that stage in his life where he's, he's trying to become a man, but he's not quite stepping up to the plate. He's not seen as a man yet by the people around him, by his friends, by his family. And then his brother is taken away from him, and suddenly he's in this position where he feels that he's got to step up to the plate and be the person that his family wants him to be. So that causes him a lot of angst. It also gives him a lot of determination as well. It gives him lots of fire under his butt and makes him want to step up to the plate and become something bigger than what people see him as.
And do you see this as I said an allegory, I guess, but also a metaphoric journey for Brisbane itself at that period of time?
Well, it was, because as Ian was saying, with the arrival of the Americans here and with the war coming in, the thing that I didn't realise before going into this show was how close Brisbane was to the Second World War, how much of a part it had to play in the Second World War with the Japanese coming so close to Brisbane, subs at the mouth of the river, and it was quite a scary time. So in the same respect, Brisbane had a lot of things thrown at it. It was always looked at as the younger sibling of the other cities, as the little country town that was trying to be a city. And it really was, because of this, it had a kick up the butt as well. It kind of had to step up to the plate and it was suddenly on the world stage, and it had to present itself in a way that it could be proud of itself. I think it was one of the first times that Brisbane actually said, you know what, it's like, we're okay. Like, we can step up to the mark and do something as well. So yeah, from both of those positions, they both kind of go on the same journey in a way.
Hayden, you're just right there. I'm just going to ask you a little bit about, how is Brisbane represented in the show? I mean, there are a number of locations that the play takes us to. What will the audience feel is familiar about what's on stage?
The big one is going to be Cloudland. When Dash takes us on a journey through Cloudland so beautifully. I remember as a boy, Mum and Dad taking me up there just to drive up there. And they'd take me to Fairyland at Mount Cootha, we'd look over the lights and these sorts of things. And I think we'll all agree that Cloudland is a place that was very special to us, that was taken from us too soon, perhaps. Something that we'd certainly like to have now. We spoke with our guests, Ian coming up from Sydney. We spoke about the houses. We spoke about Queenslanders, we spoke about the climate, we spoke about mango trees, we spoke about the smell, we spoke about our city, and Ian is responding very proudly to our city, which makes this whole group of people, really proud to be storytellers amongst it.
I know there's things like the Trocadero as well, and I remember there's even a reference to the Cremorne Theatre. You're all too young to remember, but there used to be... Some people are volunteering to say they're old enough to remember, but the Cremorne Theatre that used to be, not far from here. There used to be all this history that was here as well that's kind of been talked about in this play.
I think that's what Matt's done, is that, I don't know if I'm telling you too much, but Dash has a multifaceted role in the show, and will sometimes be directly in a scene, sometimes he'll be speaking as a narrator. And And it's the picture that he paints about, you know, as he takes you through a journey of our city, which is quite complex. It mentions a lot of different landmarks and a lot of different institutions of Brisbane. And that's you know, the beauty of what Dash has done, what Matt's done, and what Ian has put together.
I'm going to go down to Lucy, just because, you know, why not just make the microphone go as far as you can. But Lucy, I mean, you play a love interest in the work, as well as its own character. You know, she has her own life. She's not just always the love interest, but that she's part of the sign that things have changed. Do you want to tell us a little bit about her journey as a character in this play?
Yeah, definitely. So originally Rose is Frank's girlfriend, and then Danny, bless him, has the obligation, I suppose, of looking after his brother's girlfriend. So there's that side of the story, which I think is really beautiful and so familiar, that, you know, the love story and the unrequited love and the that kind of beautiful growing up section. And then Rose herself also goes on a journey which, to me, the Second World War is I don't know, so important in women's history because of the jobs and the fact that, you know, all of the men left, literally almost all of the men left, and women were doing jobs and were suddenly running the community and embracing their own empowerment, which wasn't being at home. So she being Rose is kind of representative of that side of the growing up, I think, which was the role of the woman in society, and how that is seen on a generational level. So the mother, who's played by Ronnie, that's not here, her perception of that against Rose's perception of that. And we had a beautiful visitation by Mavis, who was an entertainer for the troops during the war in Brisbane. And she just said, you know, it was awful, but the war years were the best years of my life. And there is, I think, something in that side of a war story that we don't talk about often, which is the opportunity that suddenly it presents to people that would never have an opportunity to work or travel or become an entertainer. So Rose kind of gives us a glimmer of that, I think.
The role of women's a very interesting one. There are only the 3 women in the piece. How do they represent different opportunities for women in society at that time?
Yeah, well, I guess it's the different experiences. So the generation that Ronnie represents, so Conrad's character, who's Dash's dad, sorry, this is still getting a bit confusing, isn't it, really? Family tree. It went to the First World War, so she has the experience of what it was like to be, you know, a lover in the First World War, and then Rose is in the current war. What is it like to be a woman in the current war? And then we've got Paddy, who's played by Harry down the end there. And that's the younger female's interpretation, I suppose. How much does war trickle down through the generations?
I'm going to go to Harriet because I'm just enjoying the mic going up and down. Harriet, I mean, your character, tell us a little bit about Paddy, her character, and her sense of what she's trying to do in this play.
I think Paddy, if I get it right, will be comedic relief. She represents, she supports Danny, Dash's character, in his world. He doesn't have many people that champion him, and she doesn't really champion him. She's his best friend, but that's because he is her only friend. She has no alliances really to anybody. She's kind of slightly physically deformed. She has one leg that's shorter than the other, and so she kind of is against everyone because people have teased her so much. But it's, instead of making her a victim, she's very, very strong and very, very capable. And her role in the piece is, I guess it gives, Paddy gives Danny a place to learn some ideas. It gives a chance for the audience to see Danny as just a 14-year-old boy, not a narrator, not a son, not a wannabe hero, but just a kid. And there might be a blossoming romance, who knows? But in terms of the war, it's as a 14-year-old girl probably would have been in the time. I mean, she's pretty oblivious. She's excited that there's Japanese coming. She thinks that's great. She's not scared at all. She's excited about the prospect of air raids, sirens, and jumping in bunkers. She loves it. It's a big adventure, and the reality of the situation, you know, many people dying and bloodshed doesn't get to her, which is as it would have been as a 14-year-old. You don't understand the gravity of these situations. So she represents that kind of slice of life.
Conrad, everyone plays a couple of roles, you know, there's a lot of doubling up, but your doubling up is very significant in the play. Do you want to talk us through those two characters?
Sure. The first character I play is Frank, who we see first, rather, which is Dash's brother, Danny's brother. And I guess you could say that Frank is the person that Danny looks up to, or is trying to, I guess that sibling rivalry thing of almost competing for parents' attention, which always happens. And you know, he's a fighter pilot, which is what Danny dreams of being, and all the rest of it. But Danny's super imaginative, which Frank lacks. And the best thing about Frank is that he actually sticks up for Danny and his creative side, which his dad is thoroughly against. And I won't go too much into the relationship, but basically Frank is Danny's big pillar of strength amongst his family life, and also helping him out when he's getting picked on, and he ends up getting, you know, disappears. So it moves into Andy, and Andy is very similar to his brother, and he kind of uses his artistic licenses throughout the play to imagine scenarios to help himself cope with reality, and I guess Andy becomes a figure that he takes on board to replace his brother, in a sense.
And it's interesting that, because people do see, you know, often in plays, where an actor plays two or more roles, you're not meant to notice the same actor. You know, we're trying to go, oh, it's different. In this case, it's absolutely the opposite, where everyone thinks it's Frank when they see Andy. When they see the American serviceman, they go, oh, actually, that's my brother or my son. And that kind of doubling has been deliberate to create a confusion, if you like.
Yeah, and it's been fun trying to create a difference between the two characters, a very obvious difference, but also keep elements that are similar, that Danny can sort of access and go, oh, you're my brother, you know, kind of thing, and project things onto me. So that's been a fun journey.
I'm going to come down to Stephen and talk about the space that we're in. It's so great when we come to these theatres too, that we can actually see the space in, well, as it grows. And we're pretty close to it being entirely in front of us. Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here and how that will be used during the show?
Look, this is a new play. It's never been performed before, and often for me as a designer, starting work with a director on a new play, it's all about trying to really discover the kind of play that it's going to become, because it's not all there on the page necessarily at the beginning when we're starting. So my task really as a designer is to try to create a space that the play can grow into, and that the performances can also grow into. And I like to think about the set in that sense as being like a huge playground for the actors and for the play to really romp around in. Kind of a key ingredient for me is actually working out the scale of what the playground is going to be. And as you can see with this set, it is a big playground. In fact, the wall is kind of the tallest piece of scenery that QTC have ever built. And it's big because the play is big. It's full of really big ideas. It's called Brisbane, so you know it has to be big. And then kind of working from those elements, the next sort of challenge for me as a designer is to provide an ingredient visual structure to the play. And that really came through remembering very early on something that Geoffrey Rush had, a moment in his childhood that he described to me years ago, where he used to rig up a sheet between two of the pillars underneath his Brisbane family home, and it instantly became a proscenium arch. So Ian and I worked on the idea of the world underneath the Brisbane house being a really exciting, messy, creative space for Danny's literary imagination to grow into, and that the world above the sort of the family level is quite barren and actually cold and not very, and a bit hostile actually. So separating the space into those two levels was really a very early ingredient in Ian and my thinking about how to shape the space and what we're in.
Excellent. So mostly the Queensland house. What's the back wall about then? Tell us about what that's.
Well, there is an image that Matthew has actually created within the play. That the family house is an unfinished house. It's still being built, and being built by lumps of timber that John as the father and Frank as the son kind of scrounged timber from around Brisbane, other houses being demolished and so on, in order to build their house. But it is an unfinished house with walls that have big empty holes in them. And it's actually a very beautiful image in the play. And Ian and I both loved it but didn't want to actually literally do it. So the back wall of the set is a response to that. Hopefully, you know, when you hear those words, you're sort of looking at something on stage that connects with them without it looking like an illustration of those words. But also we needed a big surface to cast shadows. We're using a lot of shadow play within the production to conjure all of the business around Danny's love of planes and flying. So we needed a big surface to cast those big shadows onto, and that's the back wall.
While we're talking about flying, I'm going to go back down to Ian. Ian, as part of hello, how are you? As part of the show, there are moments where characters fly.
Yeah.
Both literally and figuratively. You talk to us about what that means for the show itself.
Well, when you first sent me the script to have a read of course there was a stage direction that which said Danny flies a P-40 Kitty Hawk over a rioting Brisbane. And my next question was, what's the budget? But the play's got those kind of giant flourishes in it, you know, and there is something wonderful when a playwright does give you physically impossible stage direction sometimes, because it forces you to use your imagination. I mean, that's what theatre does so much better than all the other art forms, the dramatic art forms, I think, is that it invites you to open your mind. And one of the conversations, very early conversations that Stephen and I had in terms of design was working out a way that we could invite the audience to open their minds up in the way that the play needs, and also in the way that Danny's brain works. And so, in a way, you're kind of inside a 14-year-old boy's version of 1942 Brisbane. So it's stretched out, it's larger. You know, there are quite a few impossible things that happen in the play. Some of which Matthew's given us, other things just things that we've decided to throw in because they please us and hopefully please you. Little things like you'll see Churchill arrive, but because it's through the imagination of a 14-year-old boy, he just makes a cup of tea underneath the Queenslander and, you know, fiddles around with some tools and gives him a bit of advice and walks off again. And there's that sort of thing happens quite a bit through the play, and so that language is one of the we've also put into the idea of flying. So needless to say, we can't get a P-40 in here. I think the wingspan just fits. Matt and I did walk it through. But we can invite you to feel what it's like to fly. So we're using wire work in this play, very sparingly.
What's wire work?
Oh, excuse me, yeah. It's where they call it, the other word for it's flying, where you attach ropes to act as in harnesses. And so there are certain points in the play, not necessarily where you'd expect them, where characters take flight, just for a brief moment. Not quite Peter Pan, not quite Mary Poppins, but I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be fun. The reason I'm saying that is we just had the technical rehearsal for it all, and there's wires everywhere, and we're all sat at the back going, yeah, I think this can work. I think, yeah. Is anyone going to die? I think we've covered that one, Leslie.
Thank God. Getting on down to Danny, the idea, the real Danny, not the character Danny. Like you play Prime Minister Kirkham at the time, and as we're saying too, that it's seen through the eyes of a 14-year-old. What's it like to play a character that everyone will have at least done research and history about, and go, how do you create the voice? What kind of liberties do you take when you create a character like that?
Well, I was lucky with Curtin in that there are recordings of his announcement of Japan entering the war, and he has a remarkable accent. It has that kind of early century Australian quality of being fairly English and then occasionally just going, I think he actually says, men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan. So there's an element of being able to take that and run with it. In terms of it being an emanation of Danny's mind, I think it's just, you kind of play against that. You have to take it seriously as a performer, but you're aware also that you're under someone's house having an argument with Winston Churchill, who may just wander off behind the tool shed a moment later. So I don't know that I'd say it's particularly different, but it's something, I mean, you're aware of. Part of the performance style is that sometimes we're completely true and sometimes we're much more theatrical.
I was going to go down to Hugh and the whole idea. I just love passing this microphone up and down. Hugh, because you play John Monash, and that sense too of, at times, I've seen the run of the show, he's like ironing at one point, doing domestic duties or...
Yeah. Well, that's the. I think it was a matter of there was a degree of license that we were talking about. I didn't have the opportunity to find out necessarily how he sounded or what. You can do as much historical research as you like, but you're still having to give breath to what's happening within the moment. And Mr. Sinclair at the end there was sort of very kind to allow a high degree of license to explore, because as we keep saying, these are ideas that are coming from the sometimes fevered mind of a 14-year-old. But really, I think the sort of serious driver behind Monash that we're exploring was, or I am anyway, is the idea that he's a paternal figure to him. Possibly the things that he says and the way that he says them, because they're quite nurturing and supportive. They do try to offer a sense of drive and purpose to what he's doing, not always necessarily with the best outcomes, but it feels like it's Danny actually, looking for an anchor line, that older male figure who won't just disregard him or talk down to him or think less of him because he's not his older brother.
Or the notion that if he doesn't have a father figure or an older brother figure, that he will create it through these historic characters.
Absolutely, yes, and that's the twist that keeps happening with all the people that we keep meeting. Sometimes they are accurate, I suppose, in how they behaved and what they're doing, but the rest of it, as you say, we were mucking about with the idea of, and he has a kind of a series of run-ins and playoffs with General MacArthur, played by Mr. Backer here. And so we, again, building to this sense of license, when we come to the second act, it almost becomes, with a small fee for Vaudevillian, which is also placed in the first act, to try and explore the sense of, well, he almost explores them as a couple of, bickering people across the back fence. And so it was a pinny. It was a gingham pinny that I was wearing, as well as other items of clothing. But I
mean, yes, excellent. John Monash in a gingham pinny.
Yeah, which he's gone now anyway. We want to reduce that.
Going on to Macbeth, I mean, this again. Hughes alluded to it, the sense of the historical figure, but also a rivalry. Is there something in, one of Australia's greatest decorated and recognised generals fighting with an American general at the time? I think Matt often gives us these little tensions, these little moments that are demonstrations of what was going on in the time. Tell us a little bit about your playing MacArthur in this work.
Yeah, so General Douglas MacArthur, he was, you know, one of the most celebrated generals of his time. He served in World War I and then retired, and they brought him back for World War II just because he was so good at what he did. And he rocked up in Brisbane, and with his, you know, train of people, and Australia gave him a bunch of Aussies to be his commanding officers, which he dismissed straight away because they were all inexperienced in his eyes, and brought his Americans in. And so there's a great deal of egotism and confidence in him. And so when you put him up against Monash, you get a delicious amount of conflict that often results in comedic moments. But it's also sort of another fantastic childlike metaphor through Danny's eyes of the Aussies and the Americans going at it. The Aussies were just as good if, you know, they received a manual, Americans, when they came here, explaining the differences between Australians and Americans. And the Americans were very sure to put in that Aussies are just as good, if not better, at some things, so please treat them as equals. But as we find out, that sort of didn't happen. There was so much macho conflict. So it's a nice little childlike, dreamlike sequence to see two differing men go at it, but not only as generals, as men, as friends, but also Aussies and Americans. Which one's better?
Well, I know that the play pretty much puts the Battle of Brisbane to the fore, and that whole notion of what happened in this city at that particular time, and the tensions between the Australians and the American soldiers, and what that meant for all of us at that particular time. This whole idea that it lives in our collective memory, if not our lived memory, about what it meant for Brisbane. I remember grabbing a train, this was in the early mid-80s, late mid-80s, as a very young child. And I remember then, you know, the Lennon's Hotel building, and you could still see City Hall, you could still see it at that point in time, and leading up to, especially 88, all the cranes, from the Commonwealth Games through to 88, what it meant for Brisbane to grow up at that particular time. But I think that there was an equally strong sense in the 1940s of that time and what had changed for the city and how we were exposed internationally. And I think this play pretty much tells it. I mean, come over here. The notion of, see, this way I look at you and I go, Guy, excellent. The name will come any second now. But Guy, in terms of creating the sense of period, you know, you're doing all the sound design. How are you creating a sense of period through the sound? Are you creating an emotional landscape or a psychological landscape? What's been your approach to creating a space here to work in?
Well, I've taken a few different approaches for this work, in that there's very much an internal landscape for Danny and his journey of discovery through the work. There's also very much an epic nature to the telling of this story. And there's also an enormous nod to the music of the time in the show. To avoid it would have been silly, just catastrophic, really. It would have been a horrible thing to do. So there's a huge nod to music of the time, popular music of the time, and through that, I think some of the playing, the vaudevillian style of playing, the type of entertainment that was common and available in theatres of the time. So there's a few different layers musically in the play. All of them were introduced to pretty quickly in the first couple of scenes.
Are they recognisable songs?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think the audience will get up and start to dance?
Maybe. Maybe you might even want to sing along. But I've had to steer away from any vocals.
Why is that?
Well, they become very distracting, you know. So I went for all instrumental songs, but some of them you really do want to hum along to.
This huge space, we keep talking about the sense of the epic. I'm going to go to David now. David, this whole idea of the epic and the sense of the wide landscape that's been created here. As a lighting designer, and you've lit in this space so often and created a number of works here, how is this different? What's the lighting language that makes this play different to maybe some of the other things you've done?
Spatially, it is epic and has presented challenges in this space that I've not had to confront before. Just in purely technical parlance, normally when I'm working with lighting rigs here, I set the lighting bars at about between sort of 8 and 9 metres high, roughly. In this one here, the lighting bars are between 12 and 14 metres high. And if you had been here on Saturday, you would have seen us with a contraption up on top of this platform here, another 8 metres in the air, with people working 14 metres off the ground to try and focus the lights. It has epic proportions in those sense, and we're working in three-dimensional space that we're not used to working to here in the Playhouse. We've actually had to go back and look at a whole lot of things about masking and things they were storing here from the lyric and stuff that they couldn't store because all of a sudden they were visible. We'd flown all the masking out. So that, in those terms, it's been an interesting experience of just dealing with that epic space. I guess within that, though, and what's really been interesting is this sense of play and the sense that it's through a 14-year-old and a very fertile imagination of a 14-year-old. And also because of Matt Ryan and because of what he's asked for, and then through Stephen and Ian, what they've sort of said, they've sort of thrown challenges at me as to how to play in this big sandpit here. How can the actors play in it? How can we play in here? We've done some work in rehearsal with it, and I think perhaps what's really interesting in a process like this, and I was talking to Matt Ryan, the writer, yesterday at lunchtime, and there's an enormous sense of anticipation at this point in time. We're just about to embark in a technical week here in this space where this incredibly sophisticated tool that is the Playhouse is our toy. And we get to play with it and see what we can find in here that relates to the imagination that Matt's had to tell this extraordinary story. And there's an extraordinary anticipation for Matt too, in as much as this is a story that's been in his head for a long time, and it's been a long process of coming here. And he was saying how that moment next Saturday night, when the doors shut and the first preview is about to commence, just what an intense sense of anticipation that is, because it's a world premiere. It's a world premiere of a piece, and in its own way, it's part of this Brisbane coming to age. Is this whole story of us recognising who we are, where we've come from, and how this is our story. And this entire piece is part of another cog in that wheel. It's an incredibly exciting time.
Yes. I'm going to go to Stephen, just talk a little bit about the costumes now, about, again, setting period. What are we going to see? Period frocks, suits, uniforms?
Yes, all of the above. It's set during the Second World War, so there are a lot of, everyone's in a uniform really. But something very interesting came up when Ian and I started working on the costumes. There's all of this expectation about how magnificently gorgeous the American soldiers looked and how desirable they were to the Australian women. A general expectation, can I say. But when I looked at the photographs, the actual period photographs of American soldiers in Brisbane during those years, they just look like guys, they're just wearing these brown shirts and ties and backs, and so there didn't seem to be anything as essentially magnificent about the American uniform. So we've kind of romanticised it a bit. The costume department has re-dyed the American uniform so the colours match better, and we've purposely made the Australian soldiers' uniforms fit very badly in order to make the point that the play kind of needs to make. Don't be offended because the tables are turned appropriately as they should be. But because of that sort of contest between the American soldiers in uniform and the Australian soldiers in uniform, and that contest kind of comes to a head in the actual Battle of Britain, of Brisbane in Act 2. Ian and I decided that all of the other clothing should kind of be uniforms too. So the women are all in shades of the same colour, and the men's suits are all also in a little bit like a uniform.
Excellent. A couple little nuts and bolts things. First act is about an hour and 10?
Yeah, 70 minutes.
70 minutes, then with an interval, and then the second act is roughly about an hour-ish? Little under an hour. There you go, you can put a stopwatch on it. So, anyway, 2-act play. There are 9 in the cast, which is really great, but there are also people backstage you'll never get to see that are kind of doing... These ladders on the side are part of the flying mechanism, so when you get harnessed up, a person goes up and down this ladder so they can lift the person that is harnessed up here. So there are lots of people backstage for all that. The synopsis is pretty much, as we've explained, a family drama, and almost the other character is the house, the unfinished house, and Danny as the central character, played by Dash, and he's kind of coming of age, if you like, on stage. Excellent. This is our chance now to open up to questions. If you have any questions of the cast or crew, the creative team, about the show, or anything you might have to ask me. Down the front first.
I was interested when you were talking about the writing of the play. It seemed to me that there wasn't a lot of that American influence coming in, considering it was quite powerful in 1942. And the American soldiers were attracted because they had more money and silk stockings. But you know, does that come through really strongly in the play? Does that strong American feeling come in, that American influence and that animosity? Does the animosity and the American influence really come through in the play, and that sense of the tension between the Americans and the Australians? Is that coming through? Ian?
Well, as I said before, the play mixes very personal and the sort of larger historical together. And so in this what the drama that Matthew Ryan's given us, the central love interest is actually influenced by a man who comes through and literally takes the place of Frank, who died. And so it throws the sort of the emotional concerns of that, the dramatic concerns, right into the middle of the play, and then from that, a lot of extra observations can be drawn from that, I guess. So in that sense, yes, the sense of the Americans coming in and usurping us for a while until we sort of collected ourselves is pretty much the main thrust of the drama. On top of that, also, the character Danny ends up using this young American man that he attaches himself to, who happens to be rebuilding aeroplanes, and so attaches himself to that guy, to Danny. Something dry. I thought that disappeared on me. Sorry. Oh yes, that in fact he becomes a replacement father figure for a while. But while that happens, we also do have moments where he crosses the 14-year-old boy crosses the bridge into scary South Brisbane and experiences the Trocadero in all of its glory. And so, once again, it's dramatic metaphor that's being used, but certainly both ends of the scale are touched on.
There's a question here somewhere. Gentlemen in the black shirt first.
This is probably really a question for the playwright, but I'm interested that one of the characters is Monash, rather than somebody who was still alive in 1942, like Thomas Blamey, Leslie Moore's head, for instance.
I know that we'll pass to Hayden, Hayden's character, the father John, served in World War I, and what he's done is put a portrait of Monash in the lounge room or in the kitchen, in the family home. So that's why he's always a presence. You want to talk about that?
What do you want?
We'll talk about how it's related to the character of the father.
I think that he draws a lot of... sorry. He draws a lot of principles and maxims that he takes with him in his canon of life. A lot of the principles that come from his time fighting on behalf of Australia, it brings back into his household. He is of the opinion that Monash is is a wonderful tactician and deserves his knighthood that he received. I think one of the direct lines, which is, we don't have a picture of.
It's the line is, we don't have a crucifix on our wall, but we do have a picture of General Monash. So yeah, from Danny's point of view, from the view of the 14-year-old, I think Monash appears because he is almost this deified figure in the Fisher household. Dad has always talked him up to his elder brother Frank that Monash is the greatest tactician in the history of warfare, and so he becomes this. He becomes a deified figure in their household, which is why Danny sees him instead of somebody contemporary, I think.
I think Matt Ryan, the playwright, also shares a view of many people that with the ABC have produced a documentary series calling him the Forgotten Anzac. So I think that there's a political necessity for Matt too to bring it back into the consciousness of 2015. Do you want to take this one, Matt?
Yes.
Can you tell us about Matt Ryan and his background, please?
Just the question is about Matt Ryan and his background.
I actually did the first play. There used to be a Young Playwrights Award, and I did the first play with Matt when he was very young. And I also, this is talking about me, but, which is good, because we should be doing that. And then I was fortunate, Matt put up a Facebook post that I wasn't aware of just recently. Facebook is the new way of communicating for those of you that... he was talking about the Young Playwrights Awards, which is a QTC award, and then he was talking about his first main house show, he was talking about his first QTC show, he was talking about this coming of age story, and he was referencing that Danny Murphy and I were part of most of it. I don't know what that means, whether we're just old or what.
You may already know Matthew's work anyway. If you saw Kelly at the Queensland Theatre Club a couple of years ago, in fact, it's doing this massive tour throughout Australia at the moment. He's the writer of Kelly. He also did the translations for Sacre Bleu, that's going back to 2011. So he did the translations from the Fado and the... Who was the other writer? Fado and Racine? No. Oh, anyway. Is that terrible of me? Can't remember who the other writer was. So he did the translations from the French into this work. But also he's done a lot of work with a company called The Escapists. You might know a show called Boy Girl Wall. He was a writer on that. He's also done a number of things at La Boite, especially Wonderland. Summer Wonderland, sorry, was one of the shows that he did there. A Dance of Jeremiah, The Attack of the Attacking Attackers. And a number of works with this group called The Escapists, but he's been around for a number of years. And in fact, he's saying this is his 10th main house show in 10 years, so you get a sense of what he's been doing in that way. But Googling, because he's Googleable. What was the population of Brisbane in 1942?
Around 1 million. I remember reading
About 1 million. That's big. Okay, who's got a phone? Okay, by the end of this section, all this the general there.
I think it's about 400,000.
400,000. I have 400,000. Anyone more? Anyone more? 500,000. Okay, so about 400,000. But it'd be interesting to see what the difference was when the population swelled with the American troops.
By 96,000.
By 96,000 American troops. So what's that?
There's about 156,000 US troops that came into Australia in total, and the vast majority of those soldiers were either billeted here in Brisbane
Townsville and Darwin. But yeah, I think it was something like an extra 96,000 bodies showed up in a compressed space of time. I think the first American soldiers showed up here in November 41, and it swelled from there.
I've got an interesting statistic. It's related to the play. Apparently around 15,000 Australian women left Australia who married American soldiers and moved over to the United States. And those 15,000 make up the largest Australian single migration out of Australia. And that's all women who met American soldiers.
Wow. There's the woman in the red shirt first, that she might be a historian.
I'd be interested to know if there's any comments about the influence of the black American troops, because that must have been quite a shock to the Brisbane population, I imagine.
The question's about the influence of the influence. Is that working? Hello, hello. No. Now I'll speak very loudly, like it is working. The influence of the black American troops. The influence of the black American troops over the situation here and what that meant. Can I say this one thing? In one of the earlier drafts, there was in fact an African American character who got shot in the inner city after dark, and there was a reference to the whole, boundary line you couldn't cross over into the city. You're being shot for being north of the river as a black man for lots of different reasons that got changed in this particular version. But yes, there was a whole lot of conversation about that. And the notion too of what it meant to be in south of Brisbane at that time, and where the black American soldiers would go to, rest and recreate.
There were actual dance halls that were set up specifically for the Negro US servicemen, one of which in my research I discovered was called Dr. Carver's Music Hall, and it was actually located directly opposite South Brisbane train station, right where this building is.
That was one of the first, it was one of the places where that's right. It's not mentioned in the play, so it doesn't matter. But that music hall was staffed by Indigenous Australians as well. So it was, in that respect, it was a chance for them to actually get to work and be respected, even though they were only allowed to work south of the river. So it was still. There's a question of, oh, there it goes. There's a question up the back here first. Yes.
I was just going to say my mum actually served in the Women's Army in Darwin, but she retrained after the war as an early childhood teacher. She taught at Lady Gary Centre at Spring Hill, and she lived at the Valley Creche. And one of the surprises that she got was a number of dark-skinned babies who she was told were the children of African-American servicemen. And they were in the creche while their mothers were working. So that was another aspect of women during the war, I think. And also I've always understood from my parents' generation that one of the attractions of these of the American servicemen for women here was the fact that at a time of rationing, they had access to chocolates and lipstick and nylon.
We cover that.
Basically, it's talking about the liaisons between black American soldiers and maybe and Australian women, and the number of children that were at her mother's creche.
I'd just be interested to know.
It'd be interesting to know. Well, look, black people are beautiful. So, can't hold that against them.
But I wondered how many children grew up.
Yes, how many children? We could do a straw poll right now. The question, though, is what I want to know is why were American servicemen given nylon stockings? What was their thinking? I'm putting a rumour out there that they wore them. Let's see how that goes down. We've just got time for maybe two last questions. Up the back.
With this being the first time that the play's been put on, how much was rewritten, reworked during the rehearsal process and that sort of thing?
The question is because it's a brand new work, it's the first time, the world premiere, how much has been reworked and rewritten? Ian first, we might give you a bit of a look at that.
Well, one of the great challenges with a brand new work is that you don't know which bits are any good, to a certain extent. If you put on an Arthur Miller, or you put on a work by any of the greats, even a Ray Lawler, you know that every single line works because somebody did it and it worked. That's pretty simple, but when you're dealing with a play that has never been put on, you don't know. So some things are a complete mystery to you until the first audience comes through. So you have to decide, once you get the actors in, to give the work. One of the things I like to do is to treat the work as a classic text to begin with, and then push it as hard as we can to make every single line work until we can't. And then we'll turn to the writer, and then, so in this instance, Matthew's been in the room with us most of the time, and you know, some actors can observe that the etiquette better than others, but Matthew was very good in that regard, where he just quietly sat there. But he spoke under voice because he didn't want to influence the actors, so I had to listen to him like that. But quite a few changes have happened. We've still got a scene that we need to rehearse yet, for example, which was rewritten over the weekend and also as a result of yesterday's rehearsal. So yes, lots of changes, quite a few drafts. We're at draft 7, but I'd say there'd been a lot more really if we were to observe the proper drafting rules. But I think Matthew's done a really lovely job of getting it to a feeling where it does feel like it's a very solid piece of new writing. You know, it's beginning to feel like a classic, and that's a nice feeling to be.
Can I suggest that it's almost like a brand new play is written 3 times, once on the page, once in the rehearsal room, and then in front of an audience. And that sense of at each point you learn new things about a play, and you get different inputs, and it's a very collaborative art form, theatre. Because I remember Nick Enright, he used to say, doesn't matter if you write the best play in the world, if an actor can't do it 8 shows a week for, you know, how many weeks of the run, they'll never get that show, the perfect show you've written on the script. So there is this kind of sense of how it gets realised and imagined by the people who are out there on stage. And then the end of that process is the audience telling you what's good. You know, oh no, they're laughing over that really good line. Oh well, we better wait for that. Or actually, let's put that line two lines later because it's telling us something else. Or in fact, we didn't quite get that. What is the accumulative effect of this scene upon scene? And so there is all of that stuff that, you know, we use our best instincts as people who've been doing it for a long time. And we are also listening to how other people are responding. And then eventually, that's why we do previews. If you know, if people do come to previews, there's a reason why they're just slightly cheaper. It's because it's actually about us. It's about us up on stage, or the artists who are making the work. We're going. It's about. Oh, you don't think so, maybe?
No, it's the transaction.
Oh, the transaction, yeah.
Us and the audience.
I thought, oh, maybe not with. But that sense of that experience is really about going. Okay, we're letting you in so we can listen to what you're doing. It's still our working time, so it's great to have all that stuff together. Oh, Harriet.
I just wanted to say, on what Ian said, and Wesley as well, with there's a pressure and a responsibility to be in a cast delivering a new play, because you are kind of the crash test dummies. You gotta drive those lines as hard as you can. You gotta give them everything, because this is their first go. And as Ian said, we treat it like a classic until it's like, I don't know how to say this and believe myself, and then we try and work around it. But previews and it's gonna be very exciting, and there's a great responsibility, and it's kind of super exciting and quite humbling that you've been given that opportunity to deliver it for the first time, and you give it everything you've got because you want every line to work. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're getting line notes in week 2. Suddenly Matt might wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, that's wrong. And I speak for everyone when I say we're up for that. So could be draft 17 by closing night.
Now, we do have to move on. I'm sorry, I know I said 2 more questions, but I lied.